أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بلا قبض فرج والكرب على الأصحاب أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم بأنواع كمالاتك في جميع تجلياتك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد أول الأنوار الفائضة من بحور عظمة الذات المتحقق في عالمي البطون والظهور بمعنى الأسماء والصفات، فهو أول حامد ومتعبد بأنواع العبادات والقربات، والممد في عالم الأرواح والأشباه لجميع الموجودات، وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة تكشف لنا النقاب عن وجه الكريم في المراء واليقظات، وتعرفنا بك وبه في جميع المراتب والحضرات. والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، سلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا، وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. طيب مولانا, Sidi Niaz, if you would be able to read, and I'll read the footnotes when we get to them, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah. Yet how, again, can the evident fact that perspectival or partially perspectival entities, armies, beds, relations, events, groups of co-religionists, countries, intellectual schools of thought, and indeed the very cosmos, are nonetheless objective, distinctive entities in nafs al-amr, be harmonized with Tahanawi's stipulations, quote, not contingent on the perspective of a subject, i'tibar mu'tabir, and, quote, were any attendant hypothetical conceptions and mental perspectives to be ignored, the thing would still exist. In actual fact, all the foregoing has been leading up to a perhaps surprising conclusion, which is that Tahanawi's stipulation is perfectly sound. Yet, this is only because thinkers working in the later metaphysical Kalam, such as Jurjani and Taftazani, adopted a classificatory scheme which carefully made the crucial distinction between perspectival i'tibari and relational ilafi concepts and judgments that are objective in the sense of corresponding to nafs al-amr, and those that are purely subjective. It is only the latter that are precluded on Tahanawi's definition. This distinction was to become well established in Islamic thought. In his famous super commentary on the classic principles of jurisprudence, Usul al-Fiqh textbook, Jam' al-Jawami', for example, Abdurrahman ibn Jad Allah al-Bannani shows how intimately questions regarding perspectival entities are intertwined with those of nafs al-amr. It is established and well known that perspectival entity, al-amr al-i'tibari, has two meanings. The first of them is, quote, something which possesses, regardless of anyone's perspective, actuality, tahaqquq, in itself, but is not an extramental particular. And the other is, quote, that which becomes actualized by means of someone's perspective. Were this perspective to be disregarded, it would possess no actuality at all.
So note 145 on page 193. ساتم البناني حاشية العلامة البناني على شرح الجلال شمس الدين محمد بن أحمد المحلي على جمع الجوامع للإمام تاج الدين عبد الوهاب ibn Subki, volume 102. Banani goes on to explain the two meanings of kharij. The first and less common usage being synonymous with nafs al-amr, as we saw earlier in the book, and the second standard usage denoting extramental individuated particulars. So al-kharij, its standard technical meaning is individuated particulars, and nafs al-amr is a'am than al-kharij. But there is also a usage where nafs al-amr and al-kharij are taken to mean the same thing. That's especially an earlier usage, but we don't have to worry about that. That's just for the sake of completeness, and that's dealt with right at the beginning of the introduction. The meaning that we're intending is that they are distinct, or rather, al-kharij is a subset of nafs al-amr. So He then alludes briefly to different theories of Nafs al-Amr. First, a thing as existent and actualized in itself, right? الشيء في حد ذاته, the knowledge of God, and the preserved tablet. Right? So this shows just how profoundly the understanding of Nafs al-Amr as the Ayana Thabita had permeated the scholarly establishment, as it were, all across the Islamic world. So the knowledge of God, that's obviously the Akbarian perspective. The preserved tablet, that's obviously, broadly speaking, the Avicennan account as set forth by At-Tusi, as we saw a few sessions ago. In his super commentary on Ahmad al-Sijai's Nazm al-Maqulat al-Ashr, Hassanein Makhlouf attributes this distinction between i'tibariyat to Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani, this particular distinction, in his Hashiyah on the Tajreed, where i'tibariyat are divided into such as are i'tibariyat haqiqiyya, which have subsistence in Nafs al-Amr, and into those which do not, al-i'tibariyat al-fardiyya. Right, so that's in his Al-Hashiyah Thaniya ala al-Jawahir al-Muntazamat fi Uqud al-Maqulat. It's a brilliant book. However, Makhlouf goes on to adopt the position that there can be no subsistence in Nafs al-Amr other than subsistence in extra mental particulars in the mind. A position that conflicts with the tahqiq of thinkers like Dawood al-Qaysari, Ibn Baha'uddin Tashkar, Ibrahim Gorani, Galambawi, Abu Tha'il al-Lusi, and many others. The tahqiq, which is the purpose of this study to elucidate. So that earlier Kalam view is a view amongst other views. But if you look at the development of the problematic of Nafs al-Amr, from Tusi on, it's not really taken very seriously. For those who want to go into serious detail, it's very difficult to stay within the bounds of that view. But it's a view amongst other views. So my purpose in citing is not at all to imply that al-Banani adopts the tahqiq view that we are particularly supporting, but it's very interesting. It's significant that he mentions it as one of the three established options. So, but the mahal shahid here is that we're talking about the i'tibari haqiqi, right, and the i'tibari fardi. Yeah.
Thus, certain types of perspectival entities, while constitutive of human perspectives, in fact possess distinct actuality in themselves, regardless of anyone's perspective. Anyone passably familiar both with the developed, unreduced tradition of intellectual sciences, aqliyat, in Islam, and with their modern, often radically simplified and truncated manifestations, will know that Kalam can sometimes be proudly portrayed, particularly by some of its neo-advocates, as dismissing anything that is classical, anything that is classed as i'tibari, and that thereby falls off the edge of an austere, quote, objective world, populated solely by atom substances and certain kinds of accidents as, quote, subjective. The most profound questions about the fundamental structure of reality are therefore liable to be passed over in implicit favor of a linear, didactic, natural theology that dismisses all metaphysics as dangerous, but ultimately irrelevant.
Yeah.
There's a footnote there too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I think we'll jump it straight into the footnote. We'll, inshallah, illuminate what's just been said. So, this would appear to be a result of the decline of the study of the higher books of Kalam, which, thanks to Razi's efforts, would standardly subsume most of the general metaphysics of post-Avicennan philosophy. Most of the mabahith, that is. In North Africa, the relative weakness of a certain type of higher aqliyat compared to the situation in the Ottoman lands and Mughal India may be traced to the triumph in the later period of the Sanusian curriculum, which had already dominated North Africa for hundreds of years by the time of the collapse of the advanced Islamic sciences in the Sunni world at the beginning of the 20th century. Although intellectual giants like Abdurrahman Shirbini, Hassanein Makhlouf, and Shamsuddin al-Ambabi and others, al-Muti'i, for example, show that the higher stream of aqliyat had continued to exist in Egypt. Muhammad, and I'm not precluding its existence elsewhere, of course, Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Sunusi, popularly revered for his piety and miracles, radiallahu anhu, though thought, the post-Razian philosophical curriculum unsuitable for most students, and advocated a didactic, simplified Kalam that harkened back to the approach of the early Kalam theologians. What do I mean by didactic? It's simply the sense that this is, the point of Kalam is to teach you the Aqidah. You're going to learn your Aqidah through the study of Kalam. And one might think, well, that's the point of Kalam, isn't it? Well, a didactic approach means that there's not a huge amount of space allowed for real tahqiq to take place and for certain presuppositions maybe to be questioned, certainly for a methodological critique to take place. It's more, we have our more or less dogmatic presentation of the Aqidah, and now we're going to prove it, as it were. So we're going to teach you your Aqidah, and you're going to be intellectually motivated on the way. Now, it should be made very clear, Sanusi was a giant of Aqliyat. He was more than capable of writing in the post-Razian tradition. He chose not to. And I'm sure that he had his own very good reasons for choosing the particular maslak that he did. He advocated a didactic, simplified Kalam that harkened back to the approach of the early Kalam theologians. In his commentary on his own Al-Aqidah al-Kubra, Sanusi reveals his somewhat negative outlook on philosophy, lamenting Razi's inability to formulate adequate answers to the philosophers, and stating that in some of the positions he had adopted, Razi had come close to the philosophers' abominable caprices. He then quotes some anti-Razian poetry penned by Ibn Taymiyyah, which was a surprise to me, I have to say, and quotes the latter as having said, "If I met Fakhruddin Razi, I would have hit him on his head with this stick of mine." Sanusi's conservatist concern for the preservation of the Islamic creed was doubtless sincere, and the ascendancy of his Kalam works in North Africa throughout the last 4 centuries was in many ways a highly providential phenomenon, and he was also a supporter of Sheikh al-Akbar, interestingly enough, not least because of its effect in raising consciousness of the importance of creed amongst the generality of Muslims, the result of Sanusi's highly commendable insistence on the complete inadequacy of blind following in matters of faith, which I remember reading that when I read Imam Sanusi's works with my Sheikh, and his discussion of the insufficiency of taqleed when it comes to questions of fundamental creed of Iman. And it was quite an intellectual turning point, actually, because to realize that if faith is put down to other factors, emotional factors, factors which are not strictly concerned with genuine tasdiq and really recognizing the truth based on being truly convinced by the evidence, then one has a situation, well, what if a Christian comes along with a long beard, let's say from Mount Athos or something, and burning lots of beautiful incense and behaving very, very nicely indeed, and it's all about love and compassion and this and that. And what one encounters is as it's kind of a bit of a overused stereotype today, but that Muslims are not behaving well, and they can be harsh and they can be argumentative and so on. The emotional factors are probably going to sway things in favor of the monk from Mount Athos with his deep spirituality and asceticism. Now, the thing is, and his lovely behavior, the thing is, this is all hypothetical, obviously, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the creed in question. And so if the preponderating factor, the factor that causes preponderance in Aqidah, are factors other than does this correspond to Nafs al-Amr or not? And what is the evidence? If the question is not, does this creed correspond to Nafs al-Amr or not, then we have a serious problem. And this is a very, very widespread problem today. You hear it amongst Muslims, even in Jordan and other Muslim countries, that, well, the Christians behave so nicely and they're just good people. And at the end of the day, we can't really decide these differences. Is that even in principle possible? And so the point is the integrity of the Islamic creed as the expression, the most concise summation of the most fundamental truths about reality, about the nature of reality, and about our salvation and our ultimate destinies and so on, becomes severely compromised. And it's, well, that's just faith. And so we're adopting this kind of new atheist style, highly degraded conception of faith as blind faith that is just silly. And it's just something that you happen to choose because of, again, cultural factors, environmental factors, emotional factors, whatever it happens to be. So I think that is absolutely commendable. However, had he had foreknowledge of the tidal wave of the complex, skeptical, atheistic thought that the Islamic world would go on to meet in the 20th century, one cannot help feeling that Sanusi might have felt a renewed appreciation for the Razian tradition of Kalam. The Sanusian approach, which had almost completely removed general metaphysics from its curriculum, proves largely incapable of adequately facing it. This is because the post-Kantian philosophies involve skeptical re-evaluations of concepts such as essence, existence, individuation, causality, mental representation, abstraction, the nature of the most fundamental categories of cognition, and so forth, which are fundamental to the rejection of the validity of traditional conceptions of natural theology. So the fundamental problem is the, as it were, average, quote unquote, educated modern individual who, let's say, has a substantial thaqafa in philosophy, is simply not convinced by that older approach, that older form of ilm al-kalam, and those kind of very linear, merely discursive, completely uncritical, didactic approach. One simply sees that again and again. They say, well, sure, I've got I'm following the argument, but fundamentally, I can't go along with the approach. Now, is something a burhan in itself, right? Because we talk about arguments which are merely iqna'i and whether something's really a burhan in itself. Well, something might be a burhan in itself, but because of a psychological disposition or because of a shubha, more importantly, that one has from elsewhere, something that is a burhan in itself, let's say, al al-fard, fails to be iqna'i, right? It's not convincing to the person. So there are other mawani' which might have to be removed in order for the person in question to be able to see the genuinely demonstrative nature of the argument in question. It's only by returning to the umur al-amma tradition, supplemented, it is our firm conviction, by Platonic Akbarian exemplarism, that traditional realist conceptions of these foundational concepts can be reinforced and defended in our time. Dear Habibi Sheikh Asfanjad has said, Salam Sheikh, Astaghfirullah, isn't the problem with Imam Sanusi's approach not only that it can't as readily handle modern philosophy, but also that this anti-bahth tahqiq style deprived people of truth and its contemplation? I think it does if it's artificially isolated, as it wasn't intended to be, and it shouldn't be, from its larger context in a living Islamic society which places spirituality and the purification of the soul and spiritual realization at the apex. What people forget when they prioritize, let's say, Sanusi and Kalam in this isolated form, they don't realize, someone's on the modern job market, they've just got their master's degree in computer science or something, and then they're doing applications and they've got hundreds of applications, and then inevitably they don't get accepted anywhere, and they finally get accepted somewhere a million miles away where they don't know anyone, and they start their career, they're Muslims, but they're in this totally alienated state, let's say amongst non-Muslims. They're trying to get to know whatever Muslim community happens to exist in the town that they're in. and it's probably mostly Ikhwanis and Wahhabis, no offense to them. And then they turn to the internet to try and find some sense of identity and some sense of connection and some link to knowledge. And then they find, oh, well, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is this. It's the Ash'ari creed. And I'm going to teach you. They might meet someone who says, well, I'm going to solve your problem and I'm going to teach you your deen. And it's this very turgid, very discursive, very didactic, very linear, very limited form of not really philosophical inquiry, but it's really this didactic procedure by which I will teach you your aqidah and make you think that you have proofs for it. And that's not the original context of Imam Sanusi's work. I respect Imam Sanusi's work. It's done an incredible job, amazing good work for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's not my favorite. It's not what I prefer. But it existed in a context, a very, very different context, where you're living in the old city of Fez, and you're going from majlis to majlis, you're going in and out of the Qaraween masjid for the prayers, and it's not the same. And so, the point I'm making, in that traditional embeddedness of the holistic environment, as my dear Ahmed Poulkila would call it, the holistic environment, you couldn't mistake that for the essence of the deen. I wouldn't disrespect it and say, oh, it was just a therapeutic exercise to get rid of your shubhas, but it wasn't to be mistaken for realization. It was a way of providing rational foundations for the creed, which were, I think, fundamentally iqna'i. And everyone already believed it anyway. And they were living and breathing it. But it was a way of providing this additional fortification and strength and solidity and stability and established rootedness to the beliefs. What number was that? 146. Yeah. Faddal Maulana.
It would be a great shame, indicative of the pervasiveness in philosophical history of a confusion of epistemology for ontology, if these great thinkers of the great age of Kalam, utilizing this sophisticated language of the extramental, individuated, and the mind-dependent, were to be accused of relativizing the great majority of the world around us and dismissing it as, quote, perspectival, and therefore not truly real, simply because of their acknowledgement of the mental elements that inhere within it. Another footnote.
This is the danger of reading parts of the higher books of the tradition in isolation from other related, though perhaps physically separate topics. In most cases, the intelligibility of each is contingent on some degree of comprehension of the whole.
Whereas it is true that thinkers using this language rightly question whether equidity's relational elements can in any real sense be said to exist within extramental particulars, fil kharij, it is difficult to see how anyone could doubt that they have a form of existence in nafs al-amr. The particularized arrangements of our houses, for example, irrespective of whether we are always dwelling in them, certainly seem to exist in some sense. Yet, at the same time, it is an unquestionable fact that relations qua relations cannot exist in extramental individuated form.
Okay, let's do the
two of them actually.
Yeah, so irrespective of whether we're always dwelling in them, thereby actualizing their form through our contribution of their relational aspect. Again, this is a critique of it's ultimately an implied critique of that entire immanentist ontology. We discussed last time that the tartib makhsus is actually the form of these man-made objects. Now, when you talk about lots of the other entities that we were discussing, which definitely exist, armies, beds, relations, events, groups of co-religionists, countries, the universe, the very cosmos, are actually dependent upon mental elements, a particularized relationality in order to obtain. And they can't be construed as extramental particulars because they're either aggregates of extramental particulars in relation to one another. And let's say in the case of the universe and several other examples, it can never be the object of empirical experience. We can never know the individual particulars in question exhaustively. And so, strictly speaking, you'd say, well, they don't exist for Kharij, strictly speaking. If Kharij is mistaken for Nafs al-Amr, and if Kharij is interpreted narrowly as extramental particulars, which is actually the correct definition, it's just that because the word Kharij is extramental, it has this indelible tendency to confuse people and make them think that somehow extramental particulars, because that's what kharij means as a technical term, has to be exhaustive of all reality, and it's not. So the point is that relationality that obtains between extramental particulars is not an extramental particular. But would you then say, oh, the cosmos doesn't exist for kharij? Right? Well, technically, strictly speaking, it's not an extramental particular, but we'd certainly say it exists extramentally. So in that broader sense, for Kharij, it exists in Nafs al-Amr. So Habibi Asfandia, again, sorry, I'm not in a position where I can speak at the moment, so I can only write. Even if someone has the right cultural conditions for properly doubt-free, embodied and essential deen, isn't there still something lost if we don't do philosophy? Isn't the rational also valuable in its own right, not just to fill in the experiential to assuage doubt? Absolutely. I think that there's an ideal which becomes more or less realized realized to a greater or lesser degree in different historical realities. If you look at the Istanbul that Toshko Brazada depicts, for example, I'd say that it sounds like it's very, very close to the ideal, that he depicts in Al-Shaqa'iq al-Na'maniyya when he's talking about the ulama and the sheer number of ulama. It was standard that the ulama would be masters of tasawwuf or on the path in a very serious way, and they'd be masters of the aqliyat, and they'd be masters of the naqliyat. And so I'm not interested in rationalism. I think it's as much of a mistake as empiricism and as idealism and all of these, and esoterism is a mistake. They all have to be mistakes because they are, in a way, it's a kind of kufr in the technical, beautiful sense, which we've been, unfortunately, we've kind of made into a taboo word, and whenever I say it's a shame because it's a beautiful word. The kufr, it means to cover over, and in a way, they're covering over the true nature of the human being, our composite nature, the fact that we're the meeting place between the angelic and the animal. We are that barzakh, and so full knowledge, full cognition, full genuine knowledge of the world in the broadest sense, and knowledge of being, insofar as that's possible, depends upon the actualization of all of those elements, and then they're being placed into the proper hierarchy. So if there's this excessive focus on discursive reasoning, it's a problem. If there's an excessive focus, and fideism as well, all of these isms are problematic. All of these sources of knowledge have to be there. Revelation as a source of knowledge. The senses as a source of knowledge. Aql in the sense of discursive reason, aql can be used synonymously as it is by Imam al-Ghazali to mean aql, ruh, qalb, and that's really my favorite usage, and that accords with what Shaykh al-Akbar says about al-aql min haythu huwa qabil, and then as Sadruddin al-Qunawi says, reason is just one of the power, in the sense of discursive reason, just one of the powers of the spirit. The ideal is where they are maximally realized in the same person. They're all maximally realized in the same person in the proper harmony. That's the ideal. What are you working on when, and I'm not at all, as you probably know, the type of person who looks down on discursive reasoning or logic or anything, but when one is logic chopping, one has to be working on some madda, right? And what is that madda? That's the kind of perennial question. So the broad Ishraqi understanding is that madda, in the sense of logical madda, logical matter, to which you apply the logical form, the structures of logical form, is much broader, and it's multi-tiered, it's multi-layered, and it has various degrees, and it's hierarchical. and it embraces different degrees of being, literally, which correspond at least in terms of mode of epistemological approach, correspond to different human faculties. And that hierarchical relationship between those degrees of being is actually, that's the only way that metaphysical inquiry is really possible. If it's all flat and it's through abstraction, as the, let's say, Aristotelian claims, from sense objects through a glass darkly, it's not that we come face to face with those realities through that method. It's just that we infer that there's got to be a cause beyond that, and therefore there's cause. But we're still very much stuck in this world. So yes, I do think we lose something if we don't do philosophy, very much so. And I think there are some individuals, and what I mean by philosophy, someone like a Sheikh al-Akbar would be, for me, the prime example of someone doing philosophy in the sense that I want to advocate. It's nothing to do with philosophy as necessarily with philosophy as a formal discipline, but it's someone who is intent on getting to the nafs al-amr of everything, getting to the reality of everything, getting to the heart of the matter, getting to the truth of all things. So someone can have that kind of orientation and they'll be doing philosophy with their whole being. Sheikh al-Akbar was not a philosopher in the sense of a formal discipline. We have every reason to believe he read very, very widely in philosophy, but his method is not philosophical in let's say, a straightforwardly Aristotelian sense, obviously, or indeed a straightforwardly Platonic sense. But he's nonetheless the prime example for me of someone who's doing philosophy, because he is exerting his faculties, all of his powers to the utmost degree in order to try to get to the nafs al-amr of everything. But yeah, I don't think the rational should just fill in for the experiential or assuage doubts. I fully agree with you. Does al-Kharij refer only to extramental sensible particulars? No, Habibi, but in the vast majority of the cases, that is what we're talking about, especially because of an Aristotelian theory of knowledge where you start with the sensible and you abstract everything from there. So no, we're not talking about only Kharij doesn't only refer to sensible particulars, because they would say God exists fil Kharij, the angels exist fil Kharij, right? But the point is, what is fundamental from their own point of view, it's our point of view as well. It's just for us, the extramental particular is only one degree of being. It's not being itself. They will say that God exists fil Kharij, the angels exist fil Kharij, for example. But what is important when it comes to extramental particulars, it's based on the doctrine that al-wujud yatawaqqafu ala ta'ayyun. Then there's an assumption that ta'ayyun takes place under particular individuation conditions. Then there are all sorts of difficulties in terms of the question of whether there's a distinction between al-tamayuz and al-ta'ayyun. Right. And there are all sorts of difficulties which come up. But the reason that I focus on sensible particulars is because the problematic of this book is, how do we derive abstract entities, intelligible principles, without which the sciences can't operate, human cognition can't operate. We wouldn't be able to cognize the world without them. If we think that they are, to use Findlay's kind of slightly polemical language, but humorous, if we construe them as parasitic on the sensible particular. Now, if these intelligible entities in the intelligible world, as some would call it, is parasitic on the sensible particular, is it really possible to say that our subsequent employment of those intelligible apparatuses can be justified in our claim that they apply and are effectual transitively in uncovering this other realm of being, which we've just said isn't there because there's no intelligible world. These are abstracted entities, they're abstracted from extramental particulars. So it's the inability of yes, they'll say in terms of the consistency of the system, there are Khariji entities, because everything's individuated, which are not sensible, like God, right? And really the only uncontroversial example would be God. So that's just an exigency of the system. It's really not relevant here at all. What's relevant here is the extramental entities that we do encounter are the ones that we're supposed to ground all of our knowledge claims in somehow, and they happen to be sensible particulars, right? That doesn't work. That's why it says multiple occasions in the book that it's not limited to extramental sensible, because I did want to do istidrak of that shubha, but no, it's not limited to extramental sensible particulars, but in a way, it's a kind of trivial exigency of the system that, yes, there are extramental beings, because all that exists is the extramental, and al-wujud yatawaqqaf ala ta'ayyun, so everything has to be extramental. Now tell me, what are the individuation conditions of God? What are the individuation conditions of, what does it mean for God to be individuated? There's no universal. God is not an instance of a universal, na'udhu billah, right? Yes, technically and logic, you say, lowercase God is a universal, and that the real God, al-wajib al-wujud, is a juz'i, haqiqi, and so on. But really, in the tahqiq, that's aib to talk about Allah Ta'ala like that. That's fitting God into this Aristotelian, unexamined Aristotelian assumptions, which does nothing to illuminate anything, and it's a kind of bad adab. But that's the reason for the focus on extramental sensible particulars. Shall we proceed, Maulana?
Taftazani's formulation of real composite quiddities, al-murakkabat al-haqiqiyya, as having forms which effuse onto their matter in things as they are in themselves, indicates a solution to this problem, for houses and beds are also, quote, real composite quiddities.
In that, in order to be a bed, the pieces of wood require the particularized relationality of the perspectival sequence of the form resultant of their configuration, just as that particularized relationality also requires the existence of the pieces of wood to become actualized. That's clear if you were here last time. Yeah, well done.
Okay. However, the guarantor of their unquestionable objectivity seems to be neither al-kharij alone, because of the relational aspect of the quiddities, nor a dhihin alone, because the particularized arrangement of the individuated materials of the house or bed really has become manifest out there, but a combination of the two that simultaneously transcends them both, nafs al-amr.
Because although that configuration is indeed in its proximate origin mental, it nonetheless certainly possesses a form of subsistence in the extramental world, even though the relational makeup of its form cannot, as we've explained above, exist in extramental particulars. So it's the framework of relationality. It's not this idea, oh, well, relations just obtain because there are extramental particulars together in relation. You see the musadara, we're already invoking in relation to each other. The reason the relations are there is because their extramental particulars are there in relation to each other, right? So they'd say there is a tartib. Well, let's say, why can't relations be particulars? Because it's makhsus. Well, it's makhsus because of the extramental particulars and the relations which obtain between them. We're trying to account for this phenomenon, the metaphysical phenomenon of relation itself. Why do extramental particulars have the possibility? Why do they come into conditions of relationality? Relationality can't be just an absolute. This is exactly the point of this mistaking of epistemology for ontology, or of this notion that intelligible properties are somehow parasitic on extramental particulars, and that's just it. They're extramental particulars, and we get them from the extramental particulars, and as someone on Twitter said recently, we know that we can, and we just can, and we do, and therefore we can. And there's nothing more to it. Habibi, it was lovely to have you. Assalamu alaikum. The point is, it's just ignoring the problem entirely by pointing out, let's say, the epistemological procedure by which we come to know relations. That's not answering the question, why do particulars come into an intelligible framework which is relational before their particulars, right? That's a different question entirely, which immanentist philosophy can't answer. So various exegetes of Aristotle theories that they put together for how does this peripatetic system deal with these problems, the problems of what is the ontological status of abstract entities, of intelligible principles, and so on. How can they be rooted given this ontology, and so on? One of those concepts which is invoked is the agent intellect. Well, the agent intellect, as we've said many times before, is just 2 paragraphs in De Anima. There's no clue given there as to its actual identity. What is the agent intellect? What is described as its function, which, as you know, intelligibility is only latent in particulars because they're particulars. The universality is not actualized. Something has to actualize it. So what is that something? It can't be the particulars themselves because they're particulars. They're not universals. So what actualizes it is this thing called the agent intellect. Well, what on earth is the agent intellect? He gives no clue as to what it is. And that's why the identifications for what is the agent intellect are so wildly divergent. So you've got someone like Ibn Sina who says it's an actual separate metaphysical entity, which is both wahib as-suwar for all of the forms in the world and gives you the corresponding universals as well. It's very, very handy indeed. It's an actual external being, right? Whereas Aquinas says that it's internal to each individual human being's soul. It's a very, very, very different account of what's the ontological, what do we identify as answering to this function, which is the only thing that Aristotle's described. Where do we situate this in being? And they come up with completely different approaches. So yes, it is dangerous if you mean to be exhaustive, to make broad sweeping statements about immanentism. But if, as I'm trying to do, I'm trying to point out the most fundamental methodological philosophical divergence, which leads one to be able to truly say of these different systems that one is immanentist and one is exemplarist, then I think it's acceptable. But of course, when it comes down to it, one has to do justice to every individual thinker, of course. So I'll give you a little bit of a break, Sidi, as I'll just read on. I'm going to have to keep it fairly short.
Sure.
However, the guarantor of the unquestionable objectivity seems to be neither al-kharij alone, because of the relational aspect of the qualities, nor a dhihen alone, because the particularized arrangement of the individuated materials of the house or bed really has become manifest out there, but a combination of the two that simultaneously transcends them both, nafs al-amr, right? So the point is, the individuated particular ontology finds itself having to invoke entities in order to be consistent with its own ontology, which actually reveal the fundamental inconsistency of the ontology, right? Because there are extramental particular beings, but their form is actually a mental relational entity. It's not an extramental particular being. Now, this whole section is not, I'm saying it has a polemical undercurrent, which I suppose in some sense I'm realizing more and more as I go back to it. It's not meant, its basic intent is not polemical. Its basic intent is to agree with those who are muqayyad within this approach to philosophy, whether in the case of a Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani, they also transcend it on another level when they see themselves as doing engaged in a higher science, or like Imam al-Taftazani, this is it for them. This can all be understood if one realizes that al-Kharij in the sense of individuated particulars is not exhaustive, because there are also these things called i'tibariyat haqiqiyya, which are nafs amriya, right? So there is a type of internal consistency as long as one doesn't question that, which right now we're not. When we go to later chapters, we are. And it's not questioning the fundamental validity. It was saying that it has to be, these entities must be underlain by exemplary entities in order for there to be exhaustive consistency. If such perspectival entities are to be reduced to their relationality and thus effectively made to disappear from reality, is only because we cause them to be smothered by their apparent human relativity and obliterated by their utility, such that the evident teleological directedness towards the gracious assimilation of man into his environment, inherent exactly in their relationality, is liable to be lost. That is, man's encountering the idea of a house in a conception as a distinct manifestation of his simultaneous rationality and creaturehood, insofar as that rationality and creaturehood unfold in the world. Moreover, his containing within himself the physical apparatus is necessary to bring it into the realm of assent as the possible subject in an extramental proposition, qadiyya kharijiyya. The like of a house, then, is indubitably relational and intimately bound up with and contingent upon the mental world, but also possesses a profound dimension of fixity in its constituting a distinct manifestation of human rationality vis-a-vis the world, and one that is, teleologically speaking, necessary. Its presence as a seed, as it were, in man's mind is, after all, known and created by the creator of man. One of the innumerable indications that its reality, though contingent on man's, and though a branch, as it were, of his reality, is in a certain manner just as fixed and just as real as his own. Right? So this is supposed to, in some sense, question, not in the immanent realm, but ultimately, in any ultimate sense, the importance of this, of the substantial nature or fundamental nature of this distinction between man-made objects and natural objects, because they both actually possess that fixity. They are both natural, ultimately, as it were. Granted, in the ontology shared across forms of Islamic thought in which quality, al-kayf, but not relational accidents, enjoy existence, it can on the surface appear difficult to account for the ultimate rootedness in being of numerous entities and concepts. In dominant strands of the earlier Kalam tradition, at least, the act or fact of knowledge itself is perspectival. So a bit of background, you've got the famous 10 categories. زيد الطويل الأزرق ابن مالك في بيته بالأمس كان متكي بيده غصن لواه فالتواه. Right, so you've got Zayd, who's a substance, al-Tawil, which is kam, right, al-Azraq, which is kayf, and so on. Now, in the characteristic Kalam view, only substance, kayf, and ayn exist. So substance, quality, and place exist. The others don't exist, right? They're relational. This is where this whole problematic comes into place. Well, what does it mean to say that they don't exist? Because they're obviously there, and they're obviously part and parcel of the intelligibility of the world and our ability to know things and so on, and our ability to navigate the world. And so what does it mean to say they don't exist? What then is their ontological status, right? So there's a certain type of kalam that really has nothing to say about their ontological status. There's another type of kalam which has a pretty consistent understanding. And then I think that there's a best type, which is continuous with an Akbari ontology and let's say in the broader sense, a Platonic methodology, which has a fully adequate understanding of what it means to say that they don't exist, which is actually credible. And this is in terms of this, questioning the idea that al-wujud yatawaqqafu ala at-ta'ayyun, and that this particular degree of being is the only degree of being. Obviously, what I just said has to be unpacked a lot, which is, it's good that we're, inshallah, reading the rest of this book. It's actually almost exactly the second anniversary since we started it. And we're on
that's true.
Yeah, we're on page 76. So, so I'm aiming for, I think, 2027, inshallah.
It's good.
Inshallah. In dominant strands of the early Kalam tradition, at least, the act or fact of knowledge itself is perspectival, in that it is considered to come under the category of relation and nisba, right? And we've just said that nisba doesn't exist, so doesn't bode well for our knowledge claims. There isn't a way out of that, even on their own terms. But I'm just saying, in terms of the conception, it doesn't bode well. Yet, as we have just explained, this by no means implies that the objects of our knowledge do not correspond enough to the Amman, nor even that our knowledge itself does not enjoy some form of subsistence in itself. After all, maintaining that relational accidents have no extra mental particular existence, because they can't be individuated, only negates the individuated extramental existence of these abstract i'tibari objects. Right? what have we got in 152? Although, crucially, broad, early, and neo-Ash'ari Kalam provides no adequate ontology to properly ground this notion, given its denial both of extramental existence and of a realm of the subsistence, the boot of non-existent entities, non-existent, obviously, as extramental particulars. Again, the whole language of ma'dumat and the whole language of ma'dumat thabita is problematic, and it's the result, the consequence of this ascendancy of this immanentist ontology. So ma'dumat thabita, ma'dumat, non-existent entities sounds paradoxical. Well, one could easily not use the term ma'dumat, use something else. So yeah. Given it's now both of extramental and the realm of subsistence non-existent or of uninstantiated Platonic forms. See chapter 1 for an elucidation of the precise meaning of wujud khariji vis-a-vis the mind and nafs al-amr. A fuller picture of these often subtle distinctions will obtain in the reading of this study in its entirety, inshallah. Yet a clear danger nonetheless exists in the sheer fact of the intricacy and sophistication of the later Kalam tradition. If the notion of perspectival is misunderstood as a necessarily ontological rather than a merely epistemological classification, the ultimate value of our scientific knowledge, all of which depends procedurally on representational intelligibles and other abstract entities, is called into question. That is, perspectival is liable to be misinterpreted as relative and subjective. It is all the time, actually, yet this would be a dangerous error. For these perspectives, of course, constitute the fundamental ingredients of scientific knowledge. After all, intelligibles, not sensibles per se, are the proper objects of science. We go to 153. It being assumed, for example, that perspectival entities have no independent ontological reality and are therefore ultimately subjective. In fact, the perspectival aspect of such entities refers to an epistemological phenomenon. The fact that it properly refers to a merely epistemological phenomenon. Why do we say perspectival, i'tibari? It's nothing. It's not an ontological statement, wasf. It's an epistemological wasf. The fact that they must obtain in the perspective of a knowing subject in order to become actualized. Yet this doesn't mean that they could not also exist in an uninstantiated form, right? And then 154, let's just see the accounts of E.G. and Giorgiani and the relevant super commentaries of Hasan Chalabi and Selkuti. So, in both the traditional sense, So, I mean, Aristotle agreed with Plato, the proper object of science in episteme is the universal, it's not the particular. And it's not the sensible. In both the traditional sense of certain knowledge applying to all particulars and to essences themselves, after all, intelligibles, not sensibles per se, are the proper object of science. In both the traditional sense of science, of certain knowledge, sifatun tujibu tamyizan la yahtamil an-naqid, and some of them say tujibu tamyizan bain al-ma'ani la yahtamil an-naqid. And the modern sense, which speaking very broadly amounts to the study of theoretical models and inductive statements purporting to represent the various constants that can be garnered from the observation of sensible phenomena. Generalized accounts of particular phenomena are perspectival, right? What do you read in your physics textbook or in Einstein's special and general theory? You're reading generalized accounts of particular phenomena. They are perspectival and do not exist in extramental particulars. Likewise, modern science presupposes the notion of natural laws, which are purely intelligible perspectival entities. Another example has been counted in the manner in which physics must assume that mathematical representation of reality is able to capture real extramental features of reality. Yet this would be impossible should the perspectival status of mathematical models consign them to the realm of subjectivity. Likewise, traditional sciences and philosophy, their operation is contingent upon the universalization of particular phenomena, regardless of whether this universalization is construed as abstractive or not. It doesn't have to be. And presupposes that logical form, as well as general metaphysical principles and concepts that do not become instantiated extramentally, possess forms of distinct subsistence and a verifiable grounding in objective reality that justify their forming the basis for our scientific appraisals of particularized entities, or indeed of the intelligible structure of reality. The distinction between such perspectival entities as correspond to nafs al-amr then, and such as do not, saves the notion of science from ontological unjustifiability, whether it's the traditional sense or the modern sense. Yet while it is easy to affirm that perspectival objects, whether abstract, universal, or otherwise, possess some form of objective reality, that could just be an assertion, right? It is less easy to identify precisely what it is about reality that makes this so. How and in what or as what can perspectival, intelligible, abstract entities, abstract is not adequate as a term, we're just using it for convenience, be ontologically grounded beyond individual minds? In chapter 4, we will provide the foundations of the answer. In the broad intellectual context, it is notable that the majority of the later Kalam critical verifiers would in fact go on to maintain that knowledge itself, in the broader sense of perception rather than the strict sense of science, that is not a sifat and tujib an attribute that necessitates an act of discrimination, the contradiction of which is inconceivable, is from the non-perspectival category of quality, thereby affirming a form of mental existence. Its reality cannot be reduced to a relation because, according to Taftazani's formulation, is Tahdhib al-Kalam, a relation must be a relation to something. Right, what are the notes you got here? 156, 157. Okay, the majority of the Muhaqqiqun who believes in mental existence, that it's kayf, the ilm is from Maqul al-Kayf, it's Galambawi who characterizes it as the majority of the Muhaqqiqin. These, including that, so again, you get this kind of throwback kalam, which is, well, mutakallimun don't believe in mental existence. Well, actually, they do. These, including the likes of Giorgiani, Taftazani, and many others, were going to adopt the position that human knowledge is from the category of quality and thereby accepted the reality of mental existence. In the earlier period, the majority had been of the opinion that knowledge was a relation, or from the category of affection, both of which are relational and therefore perspectival. Possibly the best philosophical exposition of the controversy is Tashkib Shuhud al-Aini, a work which plays an important role later on in the study, but there's also Ibn Kamal's brilliant treatise on Wujud Dhihni, and there are many others. Right, so what is the doctrine of Wujud Dhihni? It's often misunderstood, and it's kind of difficult sometimes to figure out, well, what's the significance? Well, the significance is this is a Wujud Dhihni, which originally is underwritten by the agent intellect. And the idea of al-wujud al-dhihni is to say that there is one intelligible content which becomes manifest in two madahir. The two madahir are the mind and the extramental particulars, but the intelligible content is identical, right? It's not tamathul. It's not a representational account of, there are two broad schools of thought within Wujud Dhihni, but the one which is the tahqiq position, which is what you mean by Wujud Dhihni, is that the intelligible content is identical. It obtains in different madahir, and it's underwritten. How can it obtain in different madahir and be exactly the same intelligible content? It's one intelligible content, but it obtains in different madahir, which have different conditions. It's because it's underwritten by the agent intellect, right? Now, the Kalam thinkers who adopt Wujud Dhihni, they're not saying it's underwritten by the agent intellect, but very often, as also happened in medieval Europe, they invoke the function of the agent intellect, but they say that this is ultimately caused by God. So this is nataq al-malith fil kharij, we intellect that which does not have extramental individuated subsistence. We pass affirmative judgment on impossible entities. There's a lot going on here. One of them is, for example, that al-qadiyya al-mujiba requires the existence of the mawdu', for example, right? So that's a basic principle of logic. So how can we pass affirmative judgments on impossible entities, which don't exist, obviously, and also encounter universal concepts, whether they exist in the mind, that's right, and also encounter universal concepts in real propositions. If that intellection occurs because those concepts obtain in the mind, that constitutes exactly the conclusion we're seeking to prove, that is, the mental existence of these abstract objects. And otherwise, intellection necessarily entails a relation between the knowing subject and the intelligible object. And the notion of a relation to a pure negation, right? He says, well, idafa ila al-adam al-sirf is not ma'qul, right? ويمتنع الإضافة actually إلى العدم الصرف. And the notion of relation to a pure negation, that is, if such abstracted objects are not afforded any form of existence, is not meaningful. So there has to be a relation of the knowing subject to the object. that's musallam. That negation, you can't have a relation to pure nothingness, right? You just can't have the tahaqquq of the relation. So it has to be something there, and therefore it's mental. Thus, it can't be extramental particulars, it must be mental. Thus, if this necessary subsistence is not extramental and individuated, since this is impossible, it must be the mind itself, in the mind itself. Yeah, that's, of course, it says in the note, a much earlier Avicennan argument, but is included here apart from its virtues of concision to demonstrate the manner in which this central argument for mental existence had been naturalized into later Kalam in this important textbook, for example. I'm not saying every individual, but it was the dominant tahqiq position. I think we'll leave it there for now. I'm just going to read a sentence from over the page. End of page 80. The purpose of this necessarily detailed exposition of the perspectival aspects of quiddities and intellection has been to uncover the fact that human perspectives are objective, nafs al-amri elements of the world. Indeed, they are indispensable mental elements without which the world could not be intelligible to human beings. Accurate human representation of the world is a part of the world quite as objective as the rest of the world, as is the human contribution to the world's intelligibility. Nafs al-amr, or objective reality, is partially thus a human reality, though not a subjective human reality. The reason for this will become clear when we explore an altogether deeper region of philosophy in chapter 4. Suffice to say, it pertains to two momentous principles that underlie all that is most distinctive about Akbarian and certain late Kalam conceptions of truth and objective reality. The first is that intelligible reality is ontologically prior to physical and sensible reality. The second is that the being of the entire cosmos is radically contingent on cognition and in a different way on human beings. Yet this is strictly not a form of idealism, as that word is usually understood. Rather, it is a recognition that the very being of the world constitutes a branch of the Muhammadan reality, the perfect form of humankind from whose light it has been created, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad, and who is simultaneously its final cause. And as we will see, it is moreover a recognition that the meaning of the created being of that ultimate created essence and the most perfect locus of manifestation of the names of God, and likewise the meaning of creation as pertaining to all other essences, the exemplary realities of which arise from that Muhammadan reality, can be no other than their own self-consciousnesses. Thus, although some of the statements we will encounter in chapter 4 will seem identical in expression to the idealist esse est percipi, right, to be is to be perceived, we will see that they arise from a very different context. Moreover, even if apparently inanimate objects exist through the Muhammadan reality, through their own modes of self-consciousness, they can still exist independently alongside human beings, irrespective of whether they are being actively perceived by individual human beings. For now, we will return to somewhat more sober matters and outline the development of nafs al-amr theory within the broadly peripatetic tradition of Islamic theology and philosophy up to the time of Tashkubr-Zada, who we contend is one of the key crossover figures. To show the manner in which he combined our different Akbarian and Avicennan streams of thought, we will need to provide a somewhat detailed exposition of the Akbarian position in chapter 4. And at the end of that chapter, we will meet with Tashkubr-Zada's marrying of the two positions. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad. So that's what's coming in chapter 3, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Lovely to see you all.